The transition elements or the transition metals are found between group 2 and group 3 on the periodic table. So if you took a look at your periodic table, you would see the middle part there with these elements in it, and that's the transition metals. And there are a couple of points or a couple of features of these, properties of these, that you need to know. Compared to group 1 metals, the transition metals have much higher melting and boiling points, except for mercury. Mercury, as we know, is a liquid at room temperature. And just to give you an idea of the kind of scales we're talking about, if you look at the alkali metals, their melting points are around about 30 up to 200 degrees centigrade, whereas the transition metals, the lower end is nearer 1100 all the way up to about 1900 degrees centigrade. So you can see the melting points are much higher. The transition metals are much harder and much stronger, and they are much less reactive, and so don't react as much with water and oxygen. Now these two points are important because that makes the transition elements or transition metals good for structural materials. That means you can make buildings, or you can make structural things from these, because they don't react as much, they'll last much longer out in the air, and they are harder and stronger, and so offer that extra stability and strength for structural materials. Another group of features that you need to know is that they form ions with different charges. For example, if you look at something like sodium, which is in group 1, this will only ever form an ion that has a +1 charge, or a plus charge, whereas something like copper, which is part of the transition metals, copper can either be as a +1 charge, or sometimes you'll find it as 2+. Similarly with iron, you can have iron 2, which has a 2+ charge, or iron 3, which has a 3+ charge when it produces the ion, and that means it reacts slightly differently with other elements to form slightly different ratio of atoms in the compound. So if you were to look at iron chloride, for example, chlorine makes a chloride ion with a charge of -1, so the compound produced there would be FeCl2, whereas if you had iron 3, that would produce FeCl3, simply because we need 3 chloride ions to balance out the 3 pluses on the ion there. So they make slightly different compounds because they produce slightly different ions when they lose electrons. Now the other thing to remember is that they can form colored compounds. So for example, a couple of common ones you might know is copper sulfate. This is a blue compound. The syllabus spells it with an F for some reason of recent times, but yeah, copper sulfate is a blue compound. Iron again can form, iron 2 actually can produce green compounds, whereas iron 3 tends to form reddish brown compounds. Okay, so that's another feature of the transition elements. They form colored compounds, and depending on the metal you're talking about, they're going to form slightly different colored compounds. They're also very useful as catalysts. You'll remember from module 1 we had nickel that was used as a catalyst in producing margarine. You may remember from the Haber process, iron is a very useful catalyst in the Haber process, and various other of the transition metals can catalyze various other reactions. But overall, that's the key features of the transition elements, the transition metals. You need to be aware of those different features. Not the most interesting thing in the world, but certainly you need to understand those and be able to describe those for any questions that you may be asked.